Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Artists Talk with Zachary Schulman. My name is Mara Gittleman. I'm the Workshops and Education Coordinator at NYC Parks Green Thumb. We are the part of the New York City Parks Department that works with community gardens across the city. And we're so excited to be here tonight to hear more about Zack's work. He is a New York City-based photographer dedicated to crafting images that advance movements for social change and support progressive nonprofits. He's a member of the Walt L. Shamel Community Garden in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, where he co-manages the public composting system. When he's not gardening, he can be found cooking, fermenting, or biking to the beach. So fun. I'm ready for beach biking weather to return. And you can find more of his work at zacharyschulman.com. I will put that in the chat so that you can find it. Thank you so much, Zach, for being here with us tonight. And you have the link.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mara. Thank you, Green Thumb, for having me. It's great to be able to meet with and chat with gardeners about this project. So before I talk about myself and about the project, I just want to share a few photos from the series, and I'll be sharing a few periodically throughout the chat. So we can just start off that way. So I will pull that up. There we go. So this first photo is Marlene Wilkes from Hands and Heart Garden in East New York, Brooklyn. And I'm going to read a quote from her, from my interview with her about the garden. I want to share with everyone that even though farming is physically stressful, it is a mental de-stressor, because once you get into the garden and the plants command your attention, everything else disappears from your head until you finish gardening. It really is a mental de-stressor. Yeah, I know that as a fact. I've experienced it so many times. And that's Marlene Wilkes. This next image is Iola Sims from Rogers Tilden Veronica Place Garden in Flatbush, Brooklyn. And she says, everything is bust right open now. So we're going to need some kind of sanctuary to come through, to heal, to talk. I think the garden will be one of those places for thought. And then this is Anita Chan from Wortman Avenue Garden in East New York, Brooklyn. When people saw that we were clearing it up, they took a lot of interest. When we told them, hey, you can have a garden bed here, a lot of people were actually very excited. Being able to grow your own food is a very unique and special experience. The Healthy Soils Project helps remediate soils that are contaminated with heavy metals, mostly lead. New York City soils have been historically known to be contaminated, and we really want to combat that. The Healthy Soils Project was trying to find garden sites that can receive large deliveries of clean soil, because a lot of construction projects affiliated with the Healthy Soils Project dig pretty deep down, where they dig up glacial sediment, which is not contaminated because it's very deep down and it's safe to grow in. All right, so I thought that might be a nice way to start off the chat. So you can see some of the images and hear what some of the gardeners have to say. Well, me reading what they have to say about their experience in their gardens. So first, after that, sort of like, who am I and how did I get into community gardening? As a kid, I loved to garden. I would garden in my yard with my mom. I loved to dig through the dirt and look for worms and pull up, rotten wood piles and look for salamanders and other little critters. Digging in the soil and exploring the earth was something that was always fascinating to me. And soon after, I realized I love to eat, and I'm very intrigued by sort of what food can be grown in that soil and what wild things are edible. And so that sort of was my earliest memories of a connection to gardening. cut to a little bit later in life. I was in college. I was taking classes in environmental justice movements, ecology, urban agriculture, and my interest in food and cooking expanded. I started growing more food in my backyard, not a lot, but more of just sort of like excited to see like what I could grow, what I could eat. I got more interested in wild edibles, what could I forage, when I was walking around the woods or hiking or strolling about a park, like what are all these plants and like what parts of them could I consume? I was very food focused. And so, yeah, while I was in college, I majored in environmental studies, which really, like within the context of my studies, was really about like how people interact with the environment. It wasn't strictly ecology, it wasn't strictly earth science, it wasn't strictly sociology. It was really this interaction about how people and space are connected and affect each other. And during that time, I started volunteering with a school garden in Hamtramck, Michigan, which, if you're not familiar with that region, is technically an independent town surrounded on all four sides by Detroit. It's an old factory town from the heyday of Detroit's car manufacturing era. And so, yeah, there was this little school garden across from a public school. It was a middle and elementary school, K through 6. And so me along with a team of folks, volunteered and ran an after-school science and gardening program. And that was really my first experience in a community garden. It was a school garden, but in the context of Detroit, it was, I think, closer to what we know of and experience as a community garden in New York City. And so that was sort of my first experience with that. And simultaneously, I was taking classes on urban agriculture. I mean, from an academic perspective, I wasn't, the urban ag courses I was taking were all in the classroom. I wrote my undergrad thesis on how urban agriculture, and especially community gardens, are at this intersection of so many powerful, positive social forces. And so it was a real dynamic point in my life for studying these things from a, academic perspective, while also participating and starting to experience them a little bit in the, on the ground and with other people and in the soil. Then came back to New York. I started volunteering with a group called the More Gardens Coalition, specifically with a garden in the South Bronx called Cortlandt Avenue Association Garden. And that experience was, for me, super dynamic, super exciting. We were working on a plan to preserve a large chunk of community gardens, a large number, about 11 community gardens in the South Bronx that were threatened with destruction for housing development. And so part of what we were doing was organizing existing gardens to build their membership base and build public support for preserving as many of these gardens as possible. And so I was most closely involved with the Cortlandt Garden and bringing people in, organizing events, keeping the gates open, doing what is similar to the work that a lot of other garden leaders are doing around the city and have been doing for decades. And that was my first experience in a garden like that. I lived in Astoria for a few years. I was a member of Two Coves Community Garden, which was a new garden at the time. I worked for 4 years for Green Guerrillas, specifically on the Harvest for Neighborhoods campaign, which was a program that worked with gardens with underutilized space to grow more food and use food growing as a tool, not only in and of itself for the inherent value of growing food in a garden, but as a way of drawing more people into the garden. So as an organizing tool to build membership and ultimately power within community gardens. And so that was all structured around expanding food production in underutilized spaces. And simultaneously, I was working with a community group to revitalize Shiloh Community Garden, which is in Bed-Stuy. It was entirely vacant, inactive. And so we organized a group of people to take that on, and now it's an active green thumb garden. We did some similar work in Phoenix Community Garden in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, also in Brooklyn, to take a space that had been also entirely vacant, but had never been a community garden, and organize a community group to take it on. And this is if you haven't been to Phoenix, it's a giant garden. It's unusual because it has so much exposure to the neighborhood around it. It's about 19,000 square feet. One other way to visualize that is just under half an acre, and it's triangular, and it has fence line that it exposes probably like 90% of the frontage. So it's just a super visible place in the neighborhood. And so that's still an active community garden to this day, really doing a whole lot of good stuff. Later on, I started working for Brooklyn Queens Land Trust. And I was the program manager there for a few years, working with the few dozen community gardens that are part of Brooklyn Queens Land Trust, part of BQLT in those two boroughs, supporting those programs. And I'm currently a member of Walt L. Shamel Garden in Crown Heights. I've been a member there for probably about 14 years now. And so, and that garden, I think as Mara mentioned in the intro, I co-manage the public community composting program, which I love, as you know, it like draws back to my childhood passion of digging through the dirt and looking for bugs. And now I get excited when I dig through the compost pile and see all these critters that are munching away at our food scraps, and decomposing the things that we didn't or couldn't eat. And so I guess the reason I mention all this is I've actually spent way more time working as a community gardener and with community gardeners than I have as a photographer. And that's been the sort of the biggest influence on producing this work, that gardening is the passion, it's the drive, and then photography is the tool. Photography is the way of sharing what we're all doing as community gardeners, and it's something that, you know, it's a tool, that it's a skill, it's an art, it's a craft, however you want to describe it, that I'm also excited about. You know, I think there are some people who are talented writers and storytellers in other ways, and have, you know, there's a whole range of tools out there. And for me, it's this intersection of love of gardens and connection with gardens with skills as a photographer. And so, you know, how did I become a photographer? Where did that come in? You know, similar to my interest in gardening, I've loved taking photos since I was a kid. It had long been a hobby that I would pick up every now and then. I would practice here and there. And then in 2016, I got a little bit more serious about it. And I started working part-time professionally as a photographer, and concentrating on producing images that support social justice groups, in a broad sense, as Mara mentioned in the intro, community-based organizations, progressive nonprofits, grassroots groups, also, you know, ragtag groups of activists, all sorts of organizations or unorganized affiliated individuals who I believe are doing work that is creating a better world for everybody. Excuse me. And so in 2017, I made the jump to working full-time as a photographer. And that's sort of what I've been doing for the last 5 years, photo-wise. And so where did this project come from? This project specifically, you know, I have to give a lot of credit to Greg Anderson, who not only is on staff at Green Thumb, but is a fellow garden member at Walt L. Shamel, and have known for even longer than I've been a part of that garden. I met him when I was still at Green Gorillas, I don't know, 15 years ago, something like that. And I think we were at the Grow Together. I mean, we were at one of the Grow Togethers that was at BMCC. And I think casually he was sort of like, it's like, why don't you do a project like portraits of gardeners? And it, like, he said it and it was sort of like, well, yeah, of course. Like in my mind, I was like, and that was sort of the thing that spurred me on. I mean, parallel to that, I've been looking at, accounts on Instagram / blogs and websites like Humans of New York. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but it's sort of on the street portraits of New Yorkers, and they're just and then the caption is just sharing a story, an anecdote. And I think that a lot of these stories resonate with people, and the photography is strong. And so I've been looking at that and similar projects, and this prompt from Greg, and I was like, yeah, like I was like, yeah, I should do this. This seems like the ideal project. And so I went out in the summer of 2018, and I called up some gardeners that I knew and asked if I could photograph them in their gardens, and told them a little bit about the project. And at that point, it was just images. I sort of treated 2018 as the sort of like test phase, or the test, the test phase. And I wasn't sure sort of how I wanted to compose the images. I wasn't totally sure how I wanted to light them. I wasn't interviewing gardeners and doing the oral history portion at that point. And I went out and I made a few, and I thought the images were good. And I still think some are good. And I shared them with photo mentors of mine, people who don't have any connection to the community garden world, but I respect as photographers. And I got some really useful feedback. And a big part of it was like, they wanted more. They're sort of like, they see the image and they're just like, immediately they have all these questions. They're like, who is this person? What are they doing? What is that in the background? What's going on? I mean, they also had feedback like, about working on the composition of the images, or, sort of artistic and technical feedback. And initially I was sort of resistant. I was like, no, I just want it to be the images. I just want these like powerful images of gardeners to stand on their own. And I would include like their name and the garden and the location. But I'd been so steeped in the garden world, like I couldn't see it from the perspective of someone who doesn't know community gardens. But I thought about it, and I took their advice. My experience, it's like my technical skills are not in, or I shouldn't say, at the time they were not in video or audio production. And so I was a little hesitant to take that on. It felt like a big project already, and I was a little bit like, that might feel like a bit too much. So what I decided on that felt like it could allow the gardener, that could really like center the voice of the gardeners, was just to interview them, do an oral history, but just we sit down, we talk. I'm recording the audio so that I have a document, but not for sharing that actual audio file, but just so that I'm not furiously taking notes the entire time. And so I would do audio recordings. I would let the gardeners know I'm not actually sharing the audio recording. It's just so that I can have a transcription for later. Excuse me. And then I would go through that audio and pull out quotes that highlight what's happening in the garden and have a strong message that typifies what gardeners wanted to share. And so that's sort of like the story of how that part came to be. And so, yeah, this is a good segue to share a few more images.
And Zach, we are at about 6:30, so we have about 15 more minutes before Q&A. Thank you so much for everything you've shared so far.
For sure. So this photo here is Kofi Thomas, and he is at the People's Garden in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And Kofi says, it really became more apparent that this was a place of mental health. A lot of people were suffering from anxiety or depression, which is common in our neighborhood. I'd get text messages from people asking if I could open the garden for a couple hours, because they were feeling very dark and lonely and just wanted to sit outside for a while. There was definitely a time during this pandemic where we were one of the only places people could come and sit down. This is Ada Smothers from Macintosh Neighborhood Association Garden in Elmhurst, Queens. And Ada says, the garden was founded in 1978 by the neighbors in the Macintosh Neighborhood Association. This was an empty lot. People would use it to dump their debris, garbage, and we got together as a group of neighbors to clean up the lot and start planting. We planted vegetables, fruit, herbs, flowers. At the time, most of us were working people. I worked full time, but we would do it in the afternoon and on Saturdays when we got home from work. And that's how we worked this garden. It gives me a peace of mind. I can come by here, and it's like a safe haven for me. I come out here and nobody bothers you. It's relaxing. That's what it is to me, a safe haven. It makes my life more bearable. The beauty of it, it's so relaxing. This is Joan Belton from Merrick Marsden Neighbors Association Garden 2, Association 2 Garden in South Jamaica, Queens. And Joan Belton says, I'm proud that it's a community garden and that we're able to grow vegetables to distribute among the neighbors. And then last one for now. This is Lionel Mapp III from 5 Star Garden in Harlem. I plant the flowers up front just to draw people in. People are attracted to the smells of the garden. All right. So what was I thinking in terms of like the audience for this project, the goals for the project? My primary objectives were, first, show the gardeners with dignity, with pride, and with a sense of celebration of their work. That was at its core, that I'm totally biased. I want to celebrate their work. I'm not a journalist. I'm not approaching this with some sort of impartiality. You know, in a certain way, you could call this as like garden propaganda, if you like to use that terminology. I really wanted to highlight the work in a positive light. I especially wanted to focus on founding garden members, people who have been with the gardens for a long time, seniors, people who can tell the long-term story, or people who have been there from the beginning. And part of it was, you know, I was like, you know, I wanted to create more of a document while these people were around. And, you know, people have shared these stories. This is not like, in a lot of ways, it's not something new. But what I hadn't seen was a piece that had done it from this perspective and in this way. I'd seen a lot of academic works that celebrate and analyze all the great things that gardeners do and a lot of things that community gardens are. And that's great. That literature is largely like inaccessible to most people as like academic literature and journals. I'd seen a lot of pop journalism, mainstream journalism that shared a lot of great stuff, but was also maybe focusing, I felt like quite a bit on internal garden conflict, or rats, or just other like garden drama. And I was like, and so I felt like this fills a niche. It filled a void in celebrating the gardener's work. And so that was part of my motivation. Let's see what else. And a big part of it was that I wanted to share this with people who weren't already gardeners, that didn't know anything about community gardens. They may not live in a neighborhood where there's many community gardens or any, or they just, maybe they passed a garden and they just like don't know what's going on in there. And maybe, it's just like, maybe they'd never been motivated to say hi to the members there or go in. And so this was for anyone who just doesn't know about gardens. And so, yeah, I did that testing in 2018, cut to 2019. After getting some feedback, I went back out. I reached out to a ton of community gardeners. I explained what I was working on. I had sort of dialed in the look that I was going for. I got a better sense of the compositions that I was working on, the lighting style that I was going for. I brought, I actually just used my phone for audio recordings. I spoke on the phone with some people who I hadn't interviewed previously in the first round. Let's see. I just photographed gardeners. I just did solo portraits. As you can see, they're all solo portraits. And I write about this a little bit in the introduction for the piece that in the Earth Island Journal piece that was published. And that was largely a sort of technical and artistic decision. And I sort of want to like recognize that even though they're solo portraits, like all of these gardens are group endeavors. Even though like there's a different dynamic in every garden, I felt like I could kind of still convey a strong message about the gardens through solo portraiture. Maybe in the future down the road, I'll have pairs and trios and groups. But that was a deliberate decision on my part. Let's see what else. So then, yeah, I'm going out in 2018. I'm photographing gardeners. I'm recording interviews. I'm using some software to transcribe those interviews. I'm putting together quotes. And then COVID hits. And I'm like, oh, I'm just going to wait a little bit and then I'll restart. But you know how that all goes. And I was sort of like, well, what does the project look like now? And at a certain point, I was like, you know what? Like I need to keep doing these interviews. I'm not going to go out to gardens just yet. At that point, this was, summer of 2020. So there were a handful of gardeners that I had photographed previously, but I hadn't interviewed. So I called them up. We did some great interviews over the phone, which I was able to record. And many of the quotes that you see came from that point. And then since then, I started, working on editing the image collection, tightening up the quotes, getting them to like the sort of core elements. And then sort of pitching the story. I mean, because my goal was to share this with people who don't know community gardens, I wanted to have the piece published. And so I started putting together a little proposal, taking a subset of the images and sending it to photo editors at different publications, some hard copy magazines, some digital, some newspapers. And I pitched to about 25 editors. And one of them said, yes, we want to run this. But if we run it, we need you to run, or like, in order for us to run it, we want you to write an introduction. And I had been very reluctant initially about writing an introduction because I was like, well, my job is to do the interviews and create the images, but that's like enough of my voice. But I made a compromise and I was like, okay, fine. It's a relatively brief piece. I think it was like 350 words. I put that together. And so then the story ran as a photo essay in Earth Island Journal in November. And that's sort of where that is at with that. Sort of like, what's the future of the project? Just because the piece was published doesn't mean that it's over or done. I see this as an ongoing project. There are so many more gardens I want to get to. There's so many more gardeners I want to interview. I'm going to get back out there, probably starting in early or mid-May when things are a little bit warmer, when gardens are a little bit greener. So the photos that I'm producing show that verdant nature of the gardens. I'm applying for funding so that I can do this like sustainably for myself. And what else? I've been pitching it to different like festivals and other places where the photos might get out broadly to an audience that I wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. So far, none of them have bit, but maybe some will in the future. I would love to have a show in a garden or a number of community gardens that really is like another tool to draw people into the gardens. Yeah, let's see if there was something else on that. Yeah, those are sort of like future pieces to it. What else? Oh, I'll show a few more images real quick. All right, so this is Patty Hagan. And Patty is in St. Mark's Avenue, Prospect Heights Community Garden in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn. And Patty says, a number of people in the neighborhood who are recovering from cancer and chemotherapy like to come in and watch the bees. There are butterflies and cabbage whites right now, but we have a lot of swallowtails, commas, and painted ladies. People birdwatch a certain amount here. I've seen hawks here, cardinals, robins, and blue jays. Usually 1 or 2 days in the spring and in the fall, hummingbirds come through, either headed north or south. And if you're lucky enough to be here, you can catch them. In the spring, we always have praying mantis, this being a praying mantis sanctuary of many years. In May, the little teeny babies were all over the fennel. They started moving to other plants at the same time that the swallowtail caterpillars were hatching. It was really wonderful. Anybody who would come into the garden had never seen creatures like that. It's fun to show them, especially the children. The garden seems to draw people together. People recovering from cancer can find a quiet place to be outdoors here. It seems to do wonderful things for them. This is Efrain Estrada from United We Stand Garden in Mott Haven in the Bronx. We grow a lot of things. We have Mexican vegetables like papalo. We got jalapenos. We have eggplant. We have okra. We have collard greens. Before, early in the spring, we had lettuce. Now we've got tomatoes, corn. We have peppers, potatoes, sweet potatoes. We have cabbage. We have all kinds of greens, a lot of greens. People like to eat the greens when they're fresh. They love that. My favorite part of the garden, well, I always go for the agriculture, and I like the people to plant. I like to help the people when they don't know so much, so they have a good product. And then the last one here. This is Mike DiGiacomo from Hill Street Community Garden in Stapleton, Staten Island. Oh, sorry. I've been here for 22 years. This was a dumping ground when I got here. I took it upon myself to start removing the tires, the old air conditioners, about 1,000 paper bags that were festooned all over the place, the beer cans, the coffee cups. Eventually, I started calling New York City Department of Sanitation to get some help. They started to do this whole leveling thing. They came in here with a bulldozer and they scalped everything and left a muddy mess behind. So I came in and cleaned up all the trash that they left behind. And little by little, it started to recover. Whenever it rains, there was a washout of muddy brown water rushing into the street. It would pond down the street here. And when it eventually subsided, there was this nice fine powdered dust, and the cars would run over it. And there'd be a dust cloud every time. And guess who is breathing that in? Now, when it rains, it's clear water because the vegetation is restored on top and it holds the clay in. So last, I just wanted to chat about sort of tips for anyone who's looking to document their gardener stories. And this is all just coming from what worked for me. Everybody's going to find a different flow, different set of tools. But sort of the way I did it and the way that I found it worked best for me, there's sort of like the technical side, and then there's the substantial interpersonal side. And I'll talk first about the personal and the substantial part is sort of just like making sure people are comfortable. Get consent before recording, get consent before photographing, explain what the project is, and talk about how you want to use it or how you don't want to use it. Make sure you give them time to ask questions and listen to what any of their concerns might be beforehand, before you press record and before you take any photos. Prep a list of questions in advance, but also be ready to improvise. I love asking just sort of big open-ended questions and just letting people talk. And I find that's when the most interesting stories come out. And I'll certainly interject here and there and maybe direct the flow in certain areas, or recenter every now and then, but I might go into an interview with only 3 or 4 questions. From a technical standpoint, I'll ask people to spell out things that might come up, because it's an audio recording and I'm not writing down notes by hand. If there's a name or a place or anything that needs clarification, I always try and get people to spell it out. So then when I'm doing the transcriptions, I can have that info. If there's loud background noises, I might ask people to repeat things. I try and find a place where it's relatively quiet. In a garden, I mean, there's often, sirens and helicopters and so much car background noise and trucks and stuff. It's tricky, but do what you can to find a place where that's minimal. But I sort of jumped to the technical when a little bit too soon. In terms of questions, you can share the questions in advance. A lot of people like that, to know and to think in advance about what there is to talk about. And then share the finished product with them in whatever form it takes. And let's see, technically, or some other things. I used 2 different apps for the transcriptions. I was not doing any sort of manual transcribing of the interviews. I used one called Rev, and I used one called Otter AI. And I won't go into too much of those details unless people are curious, but they were super useful and saved me a ton of time in terms of turning an audio file into text that I could read and then copy a quote from. Let's see. And let's see if there's any other technical things. Yeah, those are just some tips and things that worked for me on the process. And before we move to the Q&A, I'm just going to share one more image, and I'll read you the quote. This is one that hasn't been published, but it's a photo that I love, and maybe it'll find its way out into the world another way, and find its way into the world sooner or later. So this is Michael Foxworth, and he is in Merrick Morrison Neighbors Association 2 Garden in South Jamaica, Queens, where he's a member. And Michael says, I'm not the farmer. I'm more like the farmhand. I love dirt. It sounds weird, but I'm from the South. I'm from South Carolina. I just like hands in the dirt. It's like just something about it. Growing up, we used to go down to my uncle's farm every summer. Father used to ship us down there every summer from Brooklyn. We'd have to stay there the whole summer. We used to have goats, pigs, and chickens, and had to go out and help weed out the cornfield and all this other stuff. Ever since then, it's something about having your hands in the dirt. Later on, it's like, ew, but when you're doing it, it's like something, it's like a release. It's like you're doing something. Plus, it's like something you can see. Most people work in an office. You never see what you do. This is like, you see it. You see it from the little tiny seed to sitting on your plate. You know where everything is coming from. It's not like going to the store and just buying it. So that's the last image that I'm going to share. And just very briefly before we move to Q&A, I think that what Michael shared and what a lot of other gardeners shared is a theme that really struck me in all of this, is that the sort of the feelings that people have, the support that the garden gives them from a mental health perspective, a sense of belonging and a sense of comfort that these gardens bring people is something that really stuck out to me and came through in a lot of my conversations with gardeners. So yeah, happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was a really, really wonderful insight into the work that you've been doing. I feel like I've known you since, I think we met when you were at BQLT. I don't think we met when you were at Green Gorillas, but it's been really wonderful to kind of watch your trajectory, and I'm a big fan of all of the work that you do, including the ragtag activist groups that in all the social justice movements. We have 2 technical questions. One, how do you store and archive your work? We'll start there.
Okay, so storage and archiving. So I first bring, when I'm photographing, I have memory cards in the camera. I bring those memory cards back to my computer at home, and I store them on the internal drive of my computer. I use a program called Capture One Pro, which keeps the images together from each session. I treat the whole project as one session. So I have a file that's this whole project, and I can tag images by garden location, gardener's name, and other criteria. I back those files up to external hard drives that sit on my desk, and then I back those files up into the cloud using a service called Backblaze that's constantly scanning my drives, and when there's new files, it sends them to the cloud. So if there's ever any sort of disaster to my computer or the external drives sitting right next to it, there's a secure one off, probably in a facility in Nevada or something, and storing and archiving. Anything else on that? Yeah, I think that's pretty much the gist.
Thank you. And then on average, how many photos did you take of each garden leader, and how did you choose just one photo of each for the Earth Island publication?
That is one of the hardest parts, is like choosing a single image. How many do I take and how do I choose? I might take anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred images. I think when I was starting the project, I was a little less adept at being more deliberate in the photography. And I was also struggling a little bit with like a technical challenge with my camera, where I didn't feel like it was focusing on the key, on the eyes of the person all the time. one thing that you might see in the photos is that there's a shallow depth of field. So there's a very small area where everything's in focus. Most of the frame is out of focus. And that means that in order for it to look sharp and to really kind of grab the attention of the person looking at the photo, the eyes need to be in focus. And so I ended up taking a lot of photos that missed the focus, where it was a little bit different part of their face or the background. And I've sort of since troubleshot my equipment so that I can be a little bit more efficient, a lot more efficient in that way. But what I was looking for when I chose the images is, besides the technical pieces, what's the overall composition? What is the image saying? Does the gardener come across in a flattering way? Does this visualize the sort of dignity and pride that I'm trying to convey? Are there elements in the photo that are distracting? Is the composition dynamic and interesting to me? How is the lighting? I mean, I was working with an off-camera strobe, a type of flash that was on a stand a few feet away from me. And occasionally it wouldn't flash because I was working it so hard that it wouldn't have time to recharge between images. So the lighting would vary. So I wanted to make sure the lighting was good. And ultimately it's sort of like, I choose the one that draw me in, that I can't look away from. And I also try to have a variety, of even when gardeners are not looking directly at the camera, which some of these photos have that element going on. I still think that there's a way to be drawn in and see the humanity and see the dynamism there. So I tried to have a variety. I wasn't, and a variety of poses. I didn't want everybody standing there with a shovel. I didn't want everybody sitting on a bench. I wanted to, so that was all, those were all considerations.
Thank you. And how do you contact and reach out to these different community gardeners?
Through the networks that I have built over the years, working with gardeners from different organizations. Some of them I've maintained relationships with, showing up for garden events, and they visited my garden, Walt L. Shamel. And so I've been in touch with them, and then I've networked through other partner groups, like East New York Farms, through Green Thumb, through Ina, and people like Ina. Ina, for example, I reached out to Ina because we've known each other for years, through multiple groups that I've worked with, and so Ina connected me with other people. And a lot of times I would show up at a garden and I would just be in touch with one person there, to set up an interview and to photograph them. And they brought out their whole crew. They brought out a bunch of fellow members, because they were they're really excited. So they've, maybe brought a member of their family and other members. And they're and I'm great, this is this is a mark that things are going well, I think. And so that was one way that I made those connections and expanded those connections, through partner organizations, and groups that I worked with, and gardeners that I've maintained relationships with.
Thank you so much. This is a really special talk. I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing, documenting the incredible work that community gardeners are doing. So thank you so much, Zach.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mara. And thanks, everybody at Green Thumb who's doing all this work and making so much of this possible. And thanks to all of you who are gardeners who are doing the amazing, fun and dirty and often challenging work of keeping the gates open and the gardens green and the flowers growing and the food growing. And and motivating me to keep up this work.